Now, there is a portion who subscribe to Mandela Effect, but firmly believe that nothing has changed except perception. Well, if you admit things are as they always have been, even if it means always have been from an alternate reality, if one were to humor the absurd idea momentarily, you effectively void the effects, since there is no confirming or refuting of anything. With this premise, it comes back full circle and remains a matter solely of perception or perspective. If it comes down to perception, that's a major problem in trying to uphold the ludicrous notion of Mandela Effect. Funny enough, this paradoxical claim of Mandela Effect works against itself within the circle of believers. It comes down to some folks saying realities are shifting and here's evidence, versus other believers who deny the evidence as something plausible. At least they have some of it right. So in essence, the idea whittled down to word against word. You have people such as myself who are total deniers of the literal sense of this effect, fallaciously assuming the effect true as an external event by arguing from personal incredulity, finally catalogues it definitively as delusion. You see, that's just it. Most people on either side will argue with one another, contesting each other's memory. This is inadequate to prove the effect, and to show change is not sufficient either, since this specific bunch of believers deny the evidence. People have been misquoting, misreading, mishearing, and misunderstanding for ages. To me, it seems when a rascal or charlatan invents the idea of a big, phenomenal metaphysical occurrence behind a convention that has existed for ages, well, now that convention becomes something. Rather than recognize human mistakes, they shift blame to a made-up scheme of overactive, paranoid imagination that further enhances the claimer's position. What the hell, you might as well start claiming trolls are what make your car run. Or when you have a random joint pain is from a voodoo doll. Or dreaming is entering another dimension. Why not chalk it up to these instead? They're just as much complex, convoluted, and unnecessary of a leap to a conclusion as is Mandela Effect. You can go on, take what's always been there, and put a new spin on it that creates a stir and piques people's interest. Maybe you can even make some money from it, right? Or come across as an expert, maybe gain popularity. All conventions in the right or wrong hands can be made out to be something else, especially with human blunders feeling it all. Residuals, as they're so-called, from a real perspective should merely be artifacts that demonstrate people made a mistake, or assume something, or somebody has changed something, or they're simply aging in degradation. Nothing more to it. Simultaneous evidence, as we have learned, confirms human error or action by showing variation. Put a magical spin on it, and evidence showing us an old or erroneous rendition, currently different, is challenged by collective mismemory. This one can reinterpret as a parallel reality residual. It's much more exciting. One comes full circle with blinders on, not realizing they are in the same position they started. As I've said in my Star Wars example video, I recognize life and the universe as dynamic, a flux of energy. Adding to that, I view life as a will to power, with every organism as a force, thwarting and expanding itself towards other forces and its environment. I see everything in the universe as a balance of forces, relationships between like forces. But I acknowledge disturbing a force recapitulates all forces. Force configuration rebalances accordingly to the strength of each force. I can't obviously get into my perspectives in full, it's beyond the scope. But briefly, do I then think a massive force, organic or not, can disturb all forces including us, or our perceptions, our sense of self, our consciousness and the way we may think, our overall vibe of our environment? Of course I do. This does happen all the time, I think. As I mentioned, aging is a lighting up of sorts to the eventual rearranging of something. And I think a disturbance through molecular, chemical, and/or electrical variants could absolutely create changes, but organic changes. Changes that make sense as a whole and throughout the whole, not select things divorced from relevant causes and effects, with the declare of the change non-affected or central to the changes as some super godlike position. That's fantasy created by ego, and certainly no changes of physical, inorganic records of things. Other than degradability, for example, a textbook, it's not going to change its title or some words because you think a parallel reality has crisscrossed with another, nor do dead people come back because they are still alive in another reality. That is stupidity created by ego to support the fantasy. If one misremembers or doesn't understand why they notice change, reasonably one does not invent fantastical ideas like multiple parallel realities for explanation, but recognizes real faults as loss of physical and physiological integrity, affecting memory, mental faculties, and critical thinking, or that perhaps powers of observation are not so common as error in perception is. Though it is through subtlety of perception and perspective that we notice real, organic changes and follow memory. In cases where memory does not follow, we designate as an internal event. We know relying on memory is questionable, but is precious no matter its susceptibility to error. It shouldn't be taken for granted in all its complexity. Yet, it seems humility in knowing this is dwindling in favor of inventing a fictional narrative. We are less aware of memory, the facts of memory as objective evaluators in everyday experience, and are more so part of its foibles. It's akin to watching a film or time-lapse video, for example, of not only our physical changes through the years, but also subtle perspective changes, as we're captivated and surprised of changes we overlook of ourselves day to day. Memory often is not what divulges error, but is itself fraught with it, and it further exacerbates its shortcomings by omitting the fact of real change. Do things change? Of course they do. They deteriorate, degrade, fade, decompose, age, grow, wither. Perspective changes, opinions may change. These are organic, real changes, not magical, non-linear, instantaneous change of content or structure in a shape-shifting sense. A stop sign will oxidize, rust, maybe fall apart. The lettering might fade from sunlight and the elements. It won't, however, suddenly read, "Please stop," without the reasonable and rational explanation that some human changed it. It's not going to magically and suddenly change its content. Organs don't just shift or suddenly take on some other role because you think a human-made illustration is slightly off from some other human-made illustration you remember seeing. Funny enough, I would even chalk up the psychological advent of Mandela Effect itself to a great external disturbance, whether molecular or electrical, but not as a literal effect occurring externally, but as a paranoia, as a half-baked belief. As I said initially, I acknowledge a psychological phenomenon spurred on possibly from the outside. But I certainly do not discount the internal as well. So, ironically, the grounded and realistic reasons the Mandela Effect community find culpable for the effect as a real and literal event, such as disturbance by a particle accelerator, I would accept as valid inducing Mandela Effect as a psychological event. Or, even more relevant, say, the mass nutritional habits, part of the work I do, and pollutant exposure degrading the physiology, contributing to lack of critical thinking and a disturbance in cognitive function. But the effect would be organic, affecting all things, impressing on them and disturbing systems, but in a real linear way, not as a Hollywood CGI effect. It would be a gradual and subtle change, only the individual's caliber of critical thinking determining interpretation of that change. Isn't that life, though? Some lack acumen and fall prey to believing as a literal supernatural occurrence, and some see it for what it is, a psychological event built precisely on mismemory, belief, suggestion, novelty, and baseless speculation.